Hey, it's Doug with Backcountry Pilgrim, and today I want to talk to you about climbing Half Dome with the cables down. Climbing Half Dome is a bucket list adventure for many people. However, many don't realize that there are actually a couple of different ways to do the famous cable route. Now, I've done Half Dome as a day hike, an overnight, with the cables up and with the cables down. So if you're looking for general information about different ways to climb Half Dome, tips and tricks, gear, video, that kind of thing, there are other videos in the description below that you can check out and get all of that general information. In this video, I just want to focus squarely on climbing the Half Dome cable route when the cables are down for the season. I'm going to skip all of the hiking and backpacking information, assume you already know it, and we're just going to start at the base of the cable route and talk specifically about what kind of gear and skills you're going to want to climb the Half Dome cables when they are down. I have linked to all the gear that I am going to be talking about in this video in the description of the video below, so definitely skip around the chapters at the bottom to learn how to use the gear, even if you don't want to hear all I have to say about it. By the way, using those links helps the channel out financially at no cost to you. Now, at the end of the video, I'm also going to give you a couple extra tips, so be sure not to miss those. Now, just to clarify for those who are not clear on this, the cables never actually come off of the rock of Half Dome. Rather, during the regular hiking season, the time which you need a permit, the cables are lifted off the ground at about waist height, every 10 feet by poles that hold the cables up and also have wooden slats between them so that you have a place to stop and rest if you need to take a break. During the off-season, when the permits are no longer required, those poles and those wooden slats are removed and the cables simply lie on the rock, anchored about every 100 feet into the rock. Now, some time ago, rock climbers realized that they could use some of the gear and skills that they had for rock climbing to actually ascend the Half Dome cable route when the cables were down, because those cables provided both a climbing aid and a safety function to get you to the summit. Now, this idea of climbing Half Dome with the cables down is neither authorized, nor regulated, nor recommended by the park. However, it is also not against any rules, and I think it can actually be a much safer way to climb Half Dome up the cable route than when the cables are up. Other reasons for climbing with the cables down will become apparent as I go through the gear and skills that you should use to do so, and hopefully it will also reveal why it might be more fun. All right, so because hiking clothing is part of hiking gear, let's just talk about that very briefly. Personally, I would say the more skin you cover, the better when it comes to climbing Half Dome, both because you're going to have massive sun exposure and because skin typically has more friction than clothing. And so while that might be nice if you're just trying to sit up against the rock, most of the time you should be on your feet. And should you fall, you don't want that friction taking your skin off if you go down the slope. Now, if you do what I'm telling you to in this video, that definitely should not happen. But even a simple fall on Half Dome could leave you bloodied up and not be a whole lot of fun. When it comes to footwear, this is a bit more important. I do not recommend hiking boots. The route up to Half Dome is one of the most popular in the park, and you're not going to have any real trouble finding it. You're not going to be scrambling off trail, climbing up rocks, doing the kinds of things that you might want mountain boots for. Most hiking boots today are really just the same material as tennis shoes with a slightly higher ankle that really isn't going to do a whole lot of good. It's just going to add to your weight. I'm not going to recommend any particular footwear because everybody's feet are different. However, I will say that if you want to know if your shoes are good for climbing Half Dome, take a look at the sole of the shoe. If it says Vibram on it, that is a good one. Vibram soles are the grippiest I've ever used, and they are pretty popular. They're on a lot of shoes. That's what I would look for if you want to have a nice sticky grip on the side of Half Dome. I highly recommend gloves if you're going to be climbing Half Dome with the cables down, because most people use them even when the cables are up. You're going to be dragging your hand along wound steel cable that is pretty abrasive, and if your skin is holding on tight enough to keep you from sliding down the cable, it's also tight enough to mess your skin up. I have usually used some pretty tight-fitting, super grippy rubberized gloves. They're pretty cheap, but they have a bomber grip, and because they are ventilated, you're not just gonna slide out of them. Now, for going up the cables when the cables are up, a lot of people just recommend regular gloves like this, gardening gloves. These are belay gloves. That's pretty fine for going up, and actually coming down, I really like these a lot because your hands are basically brakes on the way down, and being able to slide is better than having them get stuck on the cable, which is what happens with the gloves I usually use for the way up. Because you are using the cable as climbing aid on the way up Half Dome with the cables down, that grip becomes a lot more important. So I would not go with anything that's going to slide around on metal unless you really have a super strong grip strength that you can maintain for quite a while. It's a little bit of overkill to take two different pairs of gloves, so I usually just accept the fact that I'm probably going to shred my grippy gloves on the descent, and they're probably only going to be good for one use. Another thing you're going to want to keep in mind is that you're going to be using your finger dexterity to operate the gear on Half Dome, and so if you have big clunky gloves, that's going to make it very difficult. For example, these belay gloves give you good protection, but they leave your fingers exposed so that you're able to maintain dexterity. That's not a bad idea. Another thing gloves can help with are the metal burrs that you sometimes encounter on the cables. I'll talk more about those later. So for several reasons, gloves are a good idea. Now, your primary connection to the cables on Half Dome is right here. It is going to be your hands that are going to be primarily responsible for keeping your body attached to the cable as you go up the route. However, there are going to be times where you're going to have to let go in order to manipulate your gear, times when you're probably going to rest and give your hands a break, and if you're using gear for safety, your hands aren't going to cut it because that's probably what's going to fail if you need the safety gear. All right, let's get into the more proper climbing gear, and we're going to start with the harness. Your harness is what is keeping you connected to the gear that is keeping you connected to the cables on Half Dome. A rock climbing harness is basically a safety belt with a couple of leg loops to keep everything where it should be. On the front is going to be what's called a belay loop. This is the primary attachment to your gear. This is rated to catch someone in a fall. These are gear loops. These are not rated to hold you in a fall. This is just a place to hang your gear. It's this material belay loop that is rated to catch you in a fall, and this is what we're going to be using to attach all of our gear that then attaches us to the cable. Now, for climbing Half Dome with the cables down, really any harness rated for rock climbing is going to be just fine. The way you climb Half Dome with the cables down, you are not going to get into a free fall situation, or if you do, it is way too late for the safety gear to kick in. Now, this is a fairly inexpensive black diamond climbing harness, runs about $60. There are harnesses that will work just fine that are also rated for climbing that come in around $20. The difference is not that this is safe and the other one is not. The difference is this is much more lightweight and it is very heavily padded, so it's a lot more comfortable. Now, when you're hanging on your gear during a rock climb, those kind of things are a lot more important than they will be on the Half Dome ascent. What you want to be careful for is that if you go with one of the more inexpensive type harnesses, look for the CE and EN ratings and make sure that they are legit. If you want to be safe, just go with a good rock climbing brand, or just get the one in the description below and you'll be fine. Make sure you practice putting this on a couple times, cinching it up, make sure that it fits correctly before you get up on the rock. All right, next we have what I'm going to call our friction attachment. This is the main thing that is going to be used while you are climbing up Half Dome with the cables down. This won't keep you from falling, but it will keep you from sliding if you fall, and it's also going to give you a great way to take a break anytime you want to without having to mess with your gear. Now, the simplest way to make a friction attachment system is just to have a loop of climbing cord and a carabiner. The carabiner is going to snap onto your belay loop, and that is going to attach you to the cable using what's called a friction hitch, which I'll go into in a minute. Now, when choosing one of these loops, you don't want to get one so long that you can't reach the other end of it. You're going to be wanting to do your work on your gear right here when you're hanging off a 45 to 50 degree slab of granite, And if you can't reach the end of your gear, you're not going to be able to work with it. So this is far too long. This is just fine because I can work with the end of the cord without straining myself. You may notice that this has a little binding weld right here that makes one small loop on one side and keeps the rest of the loop on the other. This is just for convenience. It makes things a little cleaner. It keeps the carabiner where it's supposed to be instead of sliding up and down if you're moving. But if all you have is a standard climbing sling for a loop, that will work as well. Now, while you are doing your climb, this is going to be attached to the cable, and you're going to have to actually unhook this system to recreate a new friction hitch at a transfer point, and then you're going to have to get the carabiner back on. And you don't want to have to do this with your body. So I recommend having something that will extend how far this carabiner is from your belay loop, and that's why I add in this system right here. This consists of a small, static Dyneema sling. It's just a loop of material, extremely strong, believe it or not, even though it looks pretty small. And I clip that onto a carabiner, so this extends my carabiner out. Now, I don't really want this to be this long, at least not in normal situations, so it's time to learn our first gear skill. If you take your sling loop, put it through 2 carabiners, you now have a system that is maybe longer than you want it to be. But if you pass one carabiner through the other and then clip it onto the 2 pieces there, this will shrink down. This is what is known as an Alpine Quickdraw. It allows you to have a short connection between 2 carabiners, and this is just about right when it comes to attaching to my friction system. The nice thing about the Alpine Quickdraw is that if you end up in a situation where you need to extend it, if you take the carabiner off and just pass it through any one of those loops, it will extend back out. You definitely want to practice this before you try it on Half Dome. Now, you could just go with a standard Quickdraw or a shorter loop if they even make them. But what I like about this is that this becomes a new backup. If I get in trouble, drop a piece of gear, have a piece of gear fail on me, I've got another loop here that can be used as part of my friction hitch system. This gives me a bit of redundancy, and it's also kind of cool making an Alpine Quickdraw. Impress your climber friends. Now, you might notice I have 2 different carabiners here. I don't really think that these matter a whole lot. You can get a locking carabiner that you can spin this around so it can't open. For the applications you're going to be using this system for on Half Dome, I don't really think that's necessary. For me, speed is more important on Half Dome than really overkill safety. All right, so now this is going to go on my belay loop, and I've got my friction cord. That is my system. So now it's time to look at something very important, and that is what to do with this. This loop is going to wrap around the cable in a specific way and create what's called a friction hitch. So we're going to use this loop to tie what's called a Klemheist friction hitch onto the cable on Half Dome. First, I'm just going to show you the friction hitch that I use, and then I will discuss the other friction hitch that most people use and why I don't. This is a piece of cable that closely mimics the cables on Half Dome. It is wound steel. This is what is going to hold you to the rock. The way a friction hitch works is it essentially wraps around and grabs onto the cable for you. So this is going to be the end that you will eventually clip onto your carabiner, which will attach this back to your harness. I just start underneath and wrap it around 3 times. Then this loop goes into this one and pulls down. This is called a Klemheist. And what's nice about this is that it will slide up and down the cable very easily as you're climbing. Typically what I did was I'd keep one hand behind and one above. So as I climbed, I would slide this hand up, push the Klemheist up as I stepped, and that way I'm kind of following this up the cable. If weight is applied to the tail here, it locks up. So if this is attached to me and I slip, I'm not going to slide. If I'm going up the cable, And I'm getting tireder and tireder, and pretty soon I just feel like I got to stop and take a break. I can stop anywhere I want, let go of the cable, lean back, and I'm just gonna sit right here. No matter how tight it's been, all you gotta do is pull that out and off it comes. Now, most people climbing Half Dome use what's called a Prusik. A Prusik hitch kind of starts the same way, but what it does is it goes through itself 3 times. Forming kind of a double barrel, and then it pulls up into something like this. And in the same way that the Klemheist works, the Prusik will go up and down, but if you apply weight, it will lock in. The thing I don't like about Prusiks is that, number one, they have to be dressed a lot more carefully. It also takes a little bit longer to undo, so you have to do a lot more work to get the Prusik off. So this is slower, it is not as easy, and as far as I can tell, it really doesn't have any major advantage over the Klemheist. The nice thing about the Prusik is because the weighted point is in between these 2 barrels, it will work going up or going down. But here's the thing, I'm not worried about falling up Half Dome. I would much rather have something that is less fuss, requires less finesse, and I will tell you, having been up there, I could do a Klemheist and untie it faster than most people can tie a Prusik. So personally, I am convinced that the Klemheist is the way to go. Okay, so now that we've seen how the friction hitch system works, let's talk about the second major thing that's going to be hanging off of your belay loop. Basically, it's just another sling, a loop of material that I girth hitch into my system. A girth hitch just means you pass a bight of rope through whatever you're hitching it to, pass it through itself, and it's on. Notice again, it's not too far away from my arm. I can easily reach this even if I'm hanging off of it. This other piece of gear has a couple of different functions. The primary one is to keep you anchored to the cable system when you have to undo your friction hitch and move it at transfer points. There are actually 4 different cables on Half Dome that are anchored into the rock. And what this means is that when you get to the end of one of them, you're gonna have to untie your friction hitch and tie it on to the next cable before you continue. Now, during that time, not only are you going to be untied from the cable, you need both of your hands free to deal with the friction hitch. And during that time, if you're not in a very good position, or you slip, or it's raining, or something happens, down you go. So you need something to keep you anchored while you're moving your friction hitch, and that is what this system is for. So the idea is, when I am at the end of my cable run, I've got my friction hitch holding me. I'm going to take this, clip into the transfer point. Now they're both holding me. That allows me to let go, use my hands to undo the friction hitch, and I'm still safe. I retie my friction hitch past the transfer, I release this, and I am on my way back up the rock. This is a fairly unique system. This is not something you're just going to find running down to REI. Let me explain why these 2 pieces are different from normal slings and carabiners, and why I chose them to be my backup cord. The first thing to understand about climbing cordage or ropes is that there are static and dynamic versions. Static is something that has no give. If you fall onto a static piece of gear, it's like running your car into a concrete wall. All of the force of your stopping is going to be transferred to your body through your gear. That is why climbing ropes are dynamic. They are built to stretch a little bit. And that way, when you fall, the rope absorbs a lot of that energy. It doesn't get transferred to your body or to the other gear you're using. Now, most slings are built as an anchor. It's meant to just hold you in place while you do other stuff. It is not the kind of gear you use to fall on. This, however, is a dynamic sling. So although it's not going to stretch a lot, it at least gives you something besides that incredible jolt that you will feel if you fall on static lines. Now, of course, you shouldn't be falling on this at all, but if you have this attached to your harness and you just clip into the cable and let it kind of drag behind you, it does give you a bit of a backup. Keep in mind that if you fall and actually slide on Half Dome, you're not going to go into free fall. There's a good chance you're going to stop before you even really get going too fast. But just in case, this could stop you at one of the transfer points, and you don't want that to be a static stop. You want it to be a dynamic stop, and that's why I'm using a dynamic sling for this backup/anchor. The other special thing about this system is this carabiner. This is not a rock climbing carabiner. This is a via ferrata carabiner. It's known as a K-type. And the reason it is special is that this carabiner is designed to take full force falls, even sideways. That is not something you will find on a typical rock climbing carabiner. These carabiners are designed to pass dynamic rope through, and as long as they are strong lengthwise and that rope stretches and everything else is supposed to work, they will do just fine. However, if you are putting a full force fall onto your carabiner, it needs to be much more highly rated than a typical rock climbing carabiner. Now, I have other videos on via ferrata if you don't know what those are, but you should just know that a fall on a via ferrata is typically considered far more dangerous than a rock climbing fall. No, you don't fall very far, but you're putting a lot more force onto your gear when you fall on a via ferrata route, and you are doing a lot more potential damage to your gear because of the way the safety system works out. So a K-type via ferrata rated carabiner can take much more of a beating and could potentially take a sideways fall if you end up needing it if you slide down Half Dome. The other thing I love about these K-type carabiners is that they are a locking carabiner, so the gate doesn't open just by hitting it, but it's a grip unlock, and that means that I can open and close this carabiner just as fast as I could with a non-locking carabiner, which gives me speed and efficiency and simplicity on Half Dome. So this is something that is going to work a lot better, and it's going to keep you a lot safer because it's a dynamic system designed to catch a hard fall. So that is my system for climbing up Half Dome with the cables down. This entire system, including the harness, only weighs 1.5 pounds, and it runs about $150 unless you get a cheaper harness. All right, I promised you a few extra tips for climbing Half Dome with the cables down. Number one, when you're looking up Half Dome, you use the right-hand cable to ascend and the left-hand cable to descend. There isn't really any reason to prefer one side over the other, and if you switch it up and people are doing it the correct way, you're going to mess them up. Second tip, descending Half Dome with the cables down is, in my opinion, a lot harder than ascending. The reason for that is that the cables are kind of hanging off of Half Dome toward the bottom, but they're lying on Half Dome toward the top where it starts to curve up. This means that you have to grab that steel cable and physically lift it onto your gear, so you're bent over at 90 degrees, holding this big steel cable up, clipping it into your gear, and then trying to move down the cable. So save some energy, do some stretches before you start that descent, because once you get started, you pretty much have to continue. Finally, and this is something I learned the hard way, these cables are fairly old and they're not in fantastic shape. Occasionally, you will come to a kind of cable burr where one of the strands has popped loose and is sticking out. Well, these are very thick strands and they will go right through your skin, including your gloves or your gear, if you put pressure on them. So as you are ascending the cables, especially when you start getting close to one of these transfer points, make sure to kind of slow down, carefully slide your hand up and feel for any of those burrs, because you do not want to get stabbed or shred your gear when you're climbing Half Dome. All right, I hope this video has helped you out with information and gear and skills to climb Half Dome with the cables down. If it has, why don't you give it a like and subscribe to Backcountry Pilgrim if you're into hiking, camping, backpacking, climbing, and the gear that goes with it. If you are interested in getting more information on Half Dome, check these videos out right here. There's a lot of general information that I did not go over in this video because we are focused squarely on climbing with the cables down. Until next time, I'm Doug. Thanks for watching.